Welcome to the demonstration for manual joint venture source transactions in Oracle Fusion Joint Venture Management. From Release 24B, you can create manual joint venture source transactions in Oracle Joint Venture Management to process joint venture costs and revenue that aren't recorded in Oracle Subledger Accounting or Oracle General Ledger. Some joint operating agreements provide for the billing of stakeholders for a subset of costs that aren't associated with the cost account or capital work in progress account. These can include costs, which need to be billed to joint venture partners, for example, costs related to inventory, right of use, and prepaid expenses such as prepayments for insurance. It may also be required to allow revenue calculated for a stakeholder outside the joint venture module to be added to their partner contribution or create adjustments for only specific stakeholders in a joint venture. These complex requirements cannot be met through the standard joint venture processes that identify and distribute transactions from accounts identified as distributable to the joint venture. Creating manual joint venture source transactions helps maintain auditability of costs that are billed to partners, revenue added to partner contributions, and the amounts in the partner contribution accounts. Customers no longer need to create manual journal entries that cannot be processed by joint venture management. The following demo will show how manual joint venture source transactions can enhance your business. Let's look at a business scenario at HEPP Petroleum. HEPP Petroleum is the managing partner in multiple joint ventures with many partners and different percentages of ownership. At the beginning of the year, HEPP Petroleum makes a single payment for prepaid insurance to cover all the joint ventures for the year. HEPP Petroleum needs to bill the partners in the joint ventures for their individual share of insurance. This is a single payment, and HEPP Petroleum needs to determine how much of the total amount is attributable to each joint venture. Furthermore, the individual partners in each joint venture need to be billed their share in the joint venture. Since the original payment to the insurance company is for the total amount for all joint ventures and the cost is booked to prepaid insurance account, which is an asset account, it is not possible to process this payment through the standard joint venture processes. Let's see how it is possible to use manual joint venture source transactions to bill the prepaid insurance to all the partners in all the joint ventures, based on their individual percentage of ownership in the joint ventures. As the managing partner, HEPP Petroleum determines the amount attributable to each joint venture manually, creates a manual joint venture source transaction for each of the joint ventures for the amount attributable to each joint venture, assigns an ownership definition for the percentage share of each of the stakeholders, assigns the prepaid insurance account to the manual joint venture source transaction, runs the process to identify the transactions for each of the joint ventures to bring in the manual joint venture source transaction into joint venture management processing, runs the joint venture processes to distribute the transaction and bill the individual stakeholders on each joint venture based on the agreed ownership share. Let's begin by creating a manual joint venture source transaction to record the share of the prepaid insurance for the joint venture Permian Basin 4. You create manual joint venture source transactions in the joint venture source transactions work area. You use this work area to manage both manual transactions as well as overhead transactions that are calculated and generated by joint venture management. Let's add a manual source transaction. Start by selecting the joint venture. The default status for a manual source transaction is editing. After you enter the details, you must change the status to available to process to make it eligible for processing by joint venture management. Select the distribution type. In our scenario, prepaid insurance is a cost for the joint venture. Enter the transaction date. The transaction date will be used by joint venture management to determine the ownership percentages to be applied to this transaction when it is processed. Enter the accounting period. The processes to identify and distribute joint venture transactions includes a period parameter that you can use to determine which transactions to identify and distribute for the joint venture. Identify the account that will be cut back when the transaction is processed by joint venture management. In this case, we want to cut back the prepaid insurance account with the amounts paid by the partners. This account will be used when creating invoices for distributed manual source transactions. Before you define the partner account on the manual source transaction, ensure that the GL code combination for the partner account has been defined using Manage Account Combinations. Place your cursor over this field to display the available segment values, and then select the combination of segment values that make up the account ID. Let's click the search icon in this field and use filters to identify the segment values. Provide a transaction description for record keeping or auditing purposes. We can enter a debit or credit amount as appropriate for the selected distribution type. In the Ownership Details area, select either an ownership definition or a direct billed stakeholder for the distribution of the transaction amount. If the manual source transaction is associated with a project, complete the project fields. This transaction is not associated with a project, hence I am leaving these blank. You can include any additional information in the notes area. I'm going to change the status to available to process and then click Create. Let's go back to the manual source transaction. If a manual source transaction hasn't been processed, you can return it to editing status and update any of its details. You can include any other details in the form of attachments. At this stage, I'm going to cancel out as I do not want to make any further changes. You can add multiple manual source transactions at once using a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, which you can download from the Joint Venture Source Transactions work area. You can download, analyze, create, and edit manual joint venture source transactions using a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet that is integrated with Oracle Visual Builder add-in for Excel. The spreadsheet includes an instructions worksheet that describes how to install and enable the add-in. Make sure that you are using the latest version of the Visual Builder add-in. The spreadsheet includes instructions on how to add, update, and upload manual source transactions to the work area. Let's look at the manual source transaction for prepaid insurance. Click Download Data from the Oracle Visual Builder menu. Enter your username and password. Enter the selection criteria. One row has been downloaded. Use the Upload Changes button to upload any changes. Let me close the spreadsheet as I'm not going to be making any changes. Now that we have created the manual joint venture source transaction, let's go ahead and process the manual source transaction through joint venture management. Run the Identify Joint Venture Transactions process to identify manual source transactions for joint venture processing. Select the transaction source parameter. Choose Joint Venture Source Transactions. Verify that the job completed successfully. One joint venture source transaction has been identified. Refresh the joint venture source transactions work area. The status is updated to process complete. Let's look at the joint venture transactions work area. Here is the identified manual source transaction. Let's look at the details of the transaction. Next, run the process create joint venture distributions to distribute manual source transactions according to the ownership definition or direct billed stakeholder assigned to each manual source transaction. Refresh the joint venture transactions work area. The status is updated to process complete. The generated distributions can be viewed in the joint venture distributions work area. There are 3 distributions. Let's look at the ownership definition that was used to distribute the manual source transaction. The ownership percentages on the distributions correspond to the percentage split of the stakeholders. Let's look at one of the distributions. The distributions can be further processed like any other distribution. Cost distributions can be invoiced using receivables invoices or processed using available partner contributions before remaining balances are invoiced. Revenue distributions can be paid through a payables invoice. If the stakeholder is set to create journals, then internal transfer journal entries can be generated for the manual source transaction distributions. This concludes this demonstration.